How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the channel. We're going to be checking out where did the Australian accent come from by the channel Name Explain. Links down below for this. And the Australian accent is certainly something that's intriguing to me. Accents in general are because, excuse me, because you guys got formed by a lot of British people. And of course, I would say the Australian accent is closer to a British accent than it would be in American accent, of course, but it's miles apart from a British accent. So how did it change over the years? What's going on with that, right? Like accents are pretty interesting. So we're going to find out where did the Australian accent come from. So I would assume it definitely has a ton of British influence because that's where the population started. A lot of the population, of course, there's indigenous, Aborigine people and stuff like that too. People from the Polynesian Islands. Sorry, brain fart there. Yeah, Polynesian Islands stuff. So you're going to have some influences there that you do not have in England and Britain and stuff, so that probably does influence the accent. But we're gonna find out because I'm not a languageologist. Thanks for watching. We're gonna check this out.
Support Name Explain on Patreon for ad-free videos, exclusive podcasts and blog posts, and to help choose what names get explained. Click the link in the description. Accents are weird things, aren't they? Like, I understand why different people from around the world end up speaking different languages, but why on earth have people ended up sounding different depending on where they come from?
Yeah.
Why do specific places affect the way we speak? It seems that accents come about when people have been living together for a long enough period of time and pick up on specific speech patterns from one another until eventually everyone in the community speaks in a similar way. Accents are way more than just the way we speak, however. Not only can an accent signify where we come from, but it can also signify what socio-economic background we come from too. In example, a rich person and a poor person from the same part of London will most likely speak differently. They're truly fascinating things. This has
crazy.
of course led to some accents being more beloved than others. Undoubtedly, however, one of the most beloved accents has to be the one this video is all about, that being the dialect spoken by those from the land down under, the Australian accent. It really is one of those accents that pretty much everyone knows straight away, and everyone has attempted to do it themselves with varying degrees of success. What I find most interesting about this accent is that it's not entirely native to the land. The modern nation of Australia is primarily made up of descendants from settlers from other parts of the world, much like other nations like the USA or Brazil. This is different to many other nations, which have inhabitants that have lived there for many years and have
No, actually, that's not much different than the United States because we are also a conglomeration of a lot of different nations.
accents that are native to the land, like French and Irish in example. So where exactly did the Australian accent come from? To start with, the official language of the nation should give you a pretty clear idea as to where this story begins. While Aussies speak English, Australian English has very much become its own unique thing. Not only do they speak English, but the Union Jack is part of their flag too. If you haven't guessed by now, Australia and the United Kingdom are very much interlinked nations. Australia was in fact a colony of the British Empire from 1788 until 1901.
But it was discovered by the Dutch. They just never colonized it.
Explains to us not only why they speak English, but also shows us how exactly that famous accent started to take shape. As mentioned, the British colonization of Australia started in 1788. It was in this year that the famous First Fleet arrived in the continent. This fleet of 11 ships left Portsmouth in the southeast of England on the 13th of May 1787, carrying over 1,400 inhabitants to their new home. At this time, Australia had no European settlements, so making the land habitable was quite the challenge for the people on these ships. On these 11 boats were a huge variety of people. There were high-ranking government and military officials who'd be running the operation once they landed in Australia, but these officials brought their families with them too. On top of this, you had the ship's crew members, but also people who'd fill important roles once they arrived in the land, like builders, cooks, and various other workers.
Yeah, you gotta have them.
Most famously, of course, are the convicts on these boats too.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say, like, what about the convicts? Because I thought that there was a ton of convicts. I thought it was mostly convicts. But then again, it's like, how does the society come out of that? Did they just let the people go free? And, hey, we'll just ship you to Australia, start over new? And then you got the government, military people that went with them to keep it in order? Such a fascinating thing.
Two, there were thought to be around 700 to 800 convicts aboard the 11 ships of the First Fleet. They were being sent to Australia simply due to the growing amount of prisoners in Britain. This is something we covered in much more detail in our video about Tasmania's strange name, so go check that out. To summarise, the British Empire used Australia as a plaster for their prisoner problem, rather than fixing the problem outright. Australia wasn't just a dumping ground for Britain's convicts, as various stereotypes like to depict. Regardless as to why there were convicts in
That's what I
Australia,
heard.
they definitely were there, as well as many other people from fancy government officials and their fancy families to other various workers who were enlisted to create this new colony. All these people would have come from different parts of Great Britain and would have come from different socio-economic backgrounds too. This meant that not only did this huge variety of people arrive in Australia, but their huge variety of accents arrived in the land too. Great Britain is home to many accents and dialects, despite its relatively small size. One source pointed out that there were up to 300 different accents on this island. These changes in voice can be seen on a large scale when comparing someone from the north of England to someone from the south. However, there are even slight differences in the way people speak in counties right next to each other. Even people from different boroughs of London can speak differently. It's an island full of a staggering amount of accents, and an awful lot of these accents made their way over to Australia with the First Fleet. In the 18th century, people didn't travel as much as they do now, especially people from lower economic backgrounds. This meant that many of these people may have never heard some of these other British accents before, let alone understand them. Communicating with one another became quite a challenge, and when you are literally on the opposite side of the earth trying to create a new community from scratch in the blazing Australian heat, you kind of need to be able to communicate with one another efficiently.
I mean, it is kind of important, for sure. And how would they not be able to understand each other if it's different British dialects? Like, I mean, I guess I could understand it being a little bit hard to understand, but like to just flat out not be able to communicate, I don't see that.
From the fact that Australia is still around to this day, we can gather that these various people did manage to communicate with one another, despite the disparities in their dialect. How did they do this, however? Well, something happened to the way in which these various British people spoke their language. This something is known as dialect levelling. Dialect levelling is something that happens in the world of language and linguistics, in which various
So it's like you just take it all and you just get the average of. You add it all together and just get the average of, essentially.
distinct variations of a language strip away the things that make them distinct for ease of understanding. Words present in one dialect but not in another would be removed, and other words that are pronounced differently in different accents would be leveled out and be said in a way that fits all the different dialects and accents. Removing all these quirks and traits in a language and getting to the bare bones of it really help people who speak the same language but in vastly different accents and dialects communicate with one another, and this is exactly what happened in Australia and set the wheel.
So when you take all the British accents and just mix them all together, you get Australian. Fun to know.
Was in motion for the birth of the Aussie accent. This birth didn't happen overnight, however. It was after 50 years from that initial European settlement of Australia that the accent that we all know and love started to appear. Those initial settlers still alive after 50 years would have undoubtedly changed the way they spoke, but the real change of the accent would have come with descendants, the kids and grandkids of the initial settlers who would have spent their entire life in the accent melting pot that Australia had become.
True.
These children would have really sounded how Australians sound today. Of course, it was a huge mixture of accents that went into the creation of the Australian accent we have today, though some dialects and accents are seen as being a bit more pivotal and had a larger influence in the sound of the speech today. It seems that the South East English accent is seen as one of the key players in the Aussie accent. This makes an awful lot of sense. The First Fleet left from Portsmouth, which is in the southeast of England, and the southeast is one of the most popular parts of the country. The southeast houses London, so many important figures and convicts on these boats would have arrived from the capital. More specifically in London, we have the Cockney accent too. Cockney is seen very much as the precursor of the Australian accent. There are definitely similarities between the two, that's for sure. Likewise, Scottish is seen as having a large
I mean, there's a lot of similarities for sure. And I used to not understand the difference between Australian accent, British accent, Scottish accent, Irish accent. I know. It's a shameful thing to admit, but I admit it. I know now. I can pick out the Australian accent, separate it from the British and the Scottish and Irish though. That's still I've not watched a lot of haven't watched a lot of videos about like Scotland and Ireland enough to differentiate between the two. They're so similar, but I'm starting to get the feel for like the differences between Ireland and Scotland, or the accents at least.
Influence on the Australian accent too. However, there's one huge omission I haven't mentioned in this video yet, and that's the native accents of the Australian Aboriginals.
Yeah, I
I've read
mentioned it.
conflicting things as to whether their accent affected the Australian accent. Some say it had a direct impact on the way Aussies speak, while other sources point out that it's the other way around. While Aboriginal names and words are very present across Australia, it seems that accent isn't quite as abundant. Pretty much as soon as the accent emerged, it was instantly beloved. What's even more surprising is that when it first came about, Australian English and their Australian accent was seen by scholars of the time as the purest form of the English language. This purity of the Australian accent goes back to the dialect levelling we mentioned earlier. The people of Australia had come to speak English without any of the local quirks that plague the various forms of English spoken.
Now, one thing I have a question about is why didn't this happen in America, where we are also made from all these other places, and a lot of people from England came over as well, with, I'm assuming, all their different accents as well. Why didn't we sound like Australians? Why did our accent come out way different than Australia's accent? Like, our accent's the most boring English accent you can have, the most boring one. Australian, one of the coolest, right up there with probably Irish. I like Irish accent. So Australian, Irish, both very cool. I mean, they're all cool. England accent, like they're all better than the American one.
In the UK, all because this accent and way of speaking was born out of a means to communicate easily and efficiently. Author of The Story of Australian English, Kel Richard, explained it best, saying that Australian English is English with the dialect variations taken out. Unfortunately, this love of the Aussie accent and its position as the purest form of English wouldn't stay around for too long. Across the 18th and 19th century, some huge changes were made to the English language and the way in which it was perceived. The most noticeable change was the introduction of the concept of received pronunciation, known as RP for short. RP is named by many other names: BBC English, the Queen's English, and Oxford English, to name a few examples. It's that definitively British accent spoken by the likes of the Queen and those who present the news on BBC. It was in this period of time that RP was put on a pedestal and declared the definitive way of speaking the language. Not only was it seen as the definitive way of speaking English, but those who spoke with this kind of accent were seen as superior to other English speakers. Those who didn't speak like this in not just the UK but across the empire in general were looked down upon. It's worth noting here that despite being seen as the stereotypical way in which British people speak to this very day, very few British people actually speak in RP on a regular everyday basis. It's pretty much just the royal family and the rest of the upper echelons of British society at this point. Despite this, however, it meant that the once beloved Australian accent had gone from being seen as the purest form of English to being a rather harsh, rough and coarse accent. Sorry, Australia. Soon enough, RP was being taught in classrooms all across the empire, including Australia. Not only were young Aussies being taught to speak like this, but many posh Aussies started to use RP too, to distance themselves from their traditional Aussie accents, what was seen as unpleasant sounding in the time. Even once the country gained.
So why was they trying to teach English, like proper, like Queen's English from England? Why are they trying to teach that in Australia any damn way? I don't understand.
Its independence from the UK in 1901, people were still trying to speak with an RP accent and sound less Australian. All this brings us to today. Luckily nowadays there isn't as much stock put into RP, and by and large people aren't shamed or judged for the accents they have, at least they shouldn't be anyway. Luckily for us, RP's boost in popularity in the 19th century didn't wipe out the Aussie accent. Though what's so interesting about this dialect is that in its roughly 200 years of existence, not many variations of the accent have actually emerged. There are a few variations of the Australian accent, and the variations.
Yeah, and I did a reaction video recently, the last one, about the different types of Australian accents, because believe it or not, there is different types. I can't tell a difference between them really, but I'm sure you can if you're a real Australian.
that do exist aren't particularly related to geography, like the accents of the UK or USA in example. The Aussie accent really doesn't change that much depending on where you are from. Most sources claim that there are just 3 different versions of the Aussie accent, and these are more
3.
defined by socio-economic backgrounds as opposed
Okay.
to geographic backgrounds. These 3 are called general, broad, and cultivated. General Australian is by far the most common Aussie accent you hear. It's the way in which the vast majority of the nation speak. Someone like Hugh Jackman is a prime example of this kind of Aussie accent. Broad Australian is the accent spoken by people living in more rural areas, part of the nation that are more isolated and would have been less affected by RP and its influence in the 18th century. A great example
I was
of a
getting
broad Australian accent is with Steve.
I was gonna say, I was gonna bring this guy up. I was literally, but then I'm like, should I not? Is that like disrespectful? Like everybody's tired of talking about Steve Irwin, right? Then they bring it up. I should have just said something anyways, because now you don't even believe me.
Irwin. Cultivated Australian is perhaps the least Australian sounding of these 3 variations.
Cultivated.
It seems this accent is most linked with the high society of Australia, those whose
Okay.
ancestors did in fact pick up
So it's the RP of the Aussie world. Yeah.
on RP all those years ago. I read that Kate Blanchett is a prime example of someone with a cultivated Australian accent. In all honesty, I didn't even know she was an Aussie. The history of this accent is
I
an
didn't either.
interesting one, that's for sure. From being born out of necessity for easy communication between people from vastly different backgrounds, to being considered the pinnacle of English, to being shunned thanks to RP, to being the beloved accent it is to this day. It's even evolved more so to become its own thing, with unique Australian words and phrases. In fact, you could call this form of English and the accent sweet as bro. That's what they say in Australia, right? Thank you to all my patrons who
That
support
sounded
me.
like Kevin from Houseos. Which, by the way, that's a good show. I'm watching it on the Patreon, which I do have a Patreon. If you're interested, I got a link down below. But anyways, thanks for watching, guys. Hit like and subscribe, and get that conversation going down there about these accents, because I know you got some input. So anyways, you guys have a super fun, awesome day. I'll catch you on the next one. Take care. Bye.